So I was telling Carol, I just saw Wicked the other day, and it took all the energy in my body to like not rewrite every sermon series we had moving forward just to talk about Wicked. That's how much I enjoyed it. But when we went, my wife did not know it was a two-parter. And I will tell you, like watching her face as she came to terms with the fact that this movie was going to end after 2 hours and 40 minutes, halfway through the movie, was one of the funniest things I've ever watched happen in real time. But it was a really good movie. We are not talking about Wicked at all today, though. So we are actually in the third or fourth week, final week of our sermon series, The Butterfly Effect, where we've been talking about generosity, how like small moments of generosity, seemingly insignificant moments, can actually have really big ripple effects. And I think many of us, we've been challenging ourselves through the course of this series to talk about this. Like we think with our time, our talents, our treasure, oftentimes the things we do don't have very big implications. Like if I give someone a hug on a sad day or I'm a smiling face, like will that really change things? If I give $25 to youth in need, is that really going to do anything down the road? If I create space for someone that feels excluded, like will that really change their life? And we've been challenging ourselves through the course of this series to really believe and challenge ourselves to say, like, what would happen if what seems like to us are seemingly small and seemingly insignificant actions can actually have really big butterfly effects down the road that actually shift the landscape of the relationships, the communities, the moments around us. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about. And so we've gone through this series. We talked in the first week, Mark Sheets, a friend of mine, came. We talked about financial generosity, how that feels like a leap of faith to some of us. And when it's not necessarily moving to a specific goal or a number, but stepping towards something of trust and faith to say, like, giving of our time and our talents and our treasure is kind of a journey. We talked about relational generosity in the last couple of weeks, whether it is stories like the Good Samaritan, or what does it look like for us to create spaces for people that we disagree with or don't look like us. We told the story of Jared and Vicky, or Jared and Grammy, two very opposing people that on paper you would not assume would be friends, but they became really great friends and transformed the relationships. And today, as we kind of wrap up this series, what I want to talk about is, I think, the courage it takes in living generously. And all of it. And I've said this every week, like it's not just about our money, it's not just about serving, it's not just about our talents, it's about all of it. And so whatever is the most interesting and compelling to you to challenge yourself, that's where I want you to sit. And so maybe it's thinking about your money and like, what does it look like for me to be generous with my money? Like, and thinking courageously, what does that look like? But maybe it's with your time. What does it look like for me to be courageously generous with my time or my talents, or whatever that looks like? I don't need to be prescriptive for what lens you're viewing it from, but I think we all could really benefit from asking ourselves, like, what role does courage play in this? And what does it look like for me to step out in courage? And as I was thinking about this, like I kept getting drawn back to a really interesting story in the Gospels, a story that may be familiar to some of you and maybe you've never heard before. It's a story of Peter and Jesus and the disciples. They're out on the water, and there's this moment where some of them walk on water. And we'll get to the story in a second. It's quite interesting. And if you've never heard it before, like I want you to think about what hits you, but maybe you've heard it before. Like oftentimes we jump to the conclusion of what we've been told the story's about, or what we think it's about. Like really try to hear it with fresh ears and see it with fresh eyes and say, like, what might God be saying to me in this moment that God has never said to me before in this as I hear this? But if I was giving you like our big idea for the day, kind of the sermon in a sentence, where we're going, it would be this: that trust sparks courage, that courage drives action, and courageous action inspires radical generosity that shifts the landscape around us. And so that's really what we're exploring, is like, what does it look like to live courageously? What does it look like to move forward in action? And how do we believe that courage and that action actually sparks radical generosity that isn't just generosity unto itself, but generosity that does shift the landscape around us? I mean, our mission and vision statement is wrapped up in that, right? We want to be a church that's so radically inclusive that it shifts the landscape of spirituality and religion around us. And that's a generosity statement. We think the way that we live in generosity, with the way we love people and the way we share the gospel and the way that we engage with our time, talents, and treasure across the board, that's going to shift the landscape around us. And so we want to talk about, like, what does that look like for us in this context to approach our faith in that sort of way? And so if you want to follow along with me, our story for the day is going to be in Matthew's gospel in the 14th chapter. We're going to start in the 22nd verse. And again, it's the story of Jesus. He's just got done teaching. He kind of sends his disciples out onto the water, and this is what we read. It says, "Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds." So he just get done teaching. He sends his disciples in the boat, like, go to the other side, sends the crowds away. When he sent them away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat was fighting strong headwinds, was being battered by the waves, and was already far away from land. And so, like, all this stuff hits them, the wind and the wave and the rain. They're not close enough to come back. They're already on their way. It's this moment that feels somewhat tragic to them, right? They're getting kind of nervous. And very early in the morning, he came to the disciples talking about Jesus walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They said, "It's a ghost," and they were frightened and they screamed. I'll stop there. That would be like the minimal response I would have in this moment, right? Like, like I just last saw Jesus on this mountain. He's praying, he's doing his thing. Now I'm in this boat. Like, I would have a panic attack. Like, that's like it's terrifying, right? To like be out in that water and see, like, they're still wrestling with, is Jesus like a really cool teacher? Or is he actually the Son of God? And they're like, well, now he's doing some pretty cool stuff. Comes out in the water. They're terrified, though. They think he's a ghost, and they scream out of their fright. And it says, Jesus spoke to them, and he says, "Be encouraged. It is me. Don't be afraid." And again, I don't know how much more comforting it is that it's Jesus. It like opens up a different can of worms that this guy's out there in the water with him. It's somewhat terrifying. He says, "Don't be afraid. It is me. Be encouraged." And then Peter has what I think is like the weirdest reply in this moment. He doesn't say, like, "Can you help us?" He doesn't say, "Can you get the wind and the waves to stop?" He doesn't say, "Hey, can you like motorboat us to shore and get us out of here? You're walking on water. Can you run us to shore?" He doesn't say that. He says, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come out onto the water." And Jesus doesn't mince words. He just says, "Come." Then it says that Peter gets out of the boat, walked on water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he became frightened. He began to sink, and he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand, grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When he got into the boat, the wind settled down, and those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "You must be the Son of God." So the story is familiar to some of us, though maybe some of you are hearing it for the first time. And I think is a really interesting story, and it's not inherently about generosity, but it is wholeheartedly about courage and action, which are the things I want to talk about. And so as we think about this, I think we have to think about, like, well, what does this story have to say to us about living courageously and living actionable sorts of lives? Because for them, when they're out on this boat, the boat, like, there's wind and there's waves and there's things that are crashing around them and it's terrifying. The boat is nothing else other than safety to them. It's what they know. It's safe. It's everything around them is kind of falling apart, but this feels safe to them. And so they see Jesus coming, another symbol of safety, and there's this gap between them, but Jesus draws closer to them, and Peter says to him, like, if it's actually you, I want to walk out there. I want to close the gap between you and me, because you are ultimately the safest thing that I know. This boat is pretty safe, but you're ultimately the safest person I know, and so I want to step out of what is already safe, walk into something that's a little bit uncharted, and close the gap between you and me, because I ultimately believe that is where safety is. I want to walk towards you. And so he says, if it's really you, command me to step out and walk. And he gets out and he walks on the water towards Jesus. And when I think about, like, generosity, like, many of us are in a boat, like a time, talents, treasure, what feels comfortable to us, what feels safe to us, what feels known to us. I can't give any more financially because I'm already struggling to make ends meet. Like, that's my safety of boat. I can't give any more of my time because I'm already extended. If you guys remember, like, this time last year, I like put on a badge of honor, and I talked about how I had joined like 3 different boards. It's like I was the board of my school, and I got on the board of Pride St. Charles, and I got on the board of a few other things, and I was like so happy about it. And then like 3 weeks later, I came back, I was like, guys, I had to quit every single one of those boards. Like, the time commitment was too much, right? Like, and I looked around and I was like, I want to do these things. And I stepped out of my boat and I tried to extend myself. I maybe stepped a little too far out. I did too many things. But there is this balance, right, of protecting ourselves inside the safety of where we were, and then overextending ourselves, thinking that's what our requirement is, that we have to stretch ourselves and give everything that we have financially, give everything we have time-wise, or give everything we have talent-wise. I don't think that's exactly what Jesus is commanding, but he's asking us to close the gap, to walk a little bit closer to where he is out on the water. And that's what we see Peter does. And for him, this courage starts with trust. And I think for us, when we think about generosity, generosity of all kinds begins with trust. Like, there's the safety of the boat that we're in. And I would ask you to ponder, like, what is your boat? Like, what is your safety net? Whether it's relationally, financially, spiritually, gift-wise, like, what is the boat that you've built, the safe thing that you keep yourself in. And we see in this story with Peter, he is comfortable in the boat. But he's also like, there has to be a little bit more outside of this. He says, Jesus, if it's really you, I don't want you to take us to safety. I don't want you to push us away. I don't want you to help us. I want to actually walk where you're walking. And that's like a huge level of trust that he has to have, not just to ask that, because what if Jesus says no? Like, he has to ask that. That's a big level of trust. But then he has to step out of the boat. He has to get 1 foot over the edge of that boat and believe that as his foot touches the water, that he is not going to immediately sink. And what's amazing is we see the story continues, and he doesn't immediately sink. It says that he gets on water and he walks towards Jesus. And when I open up my Bible, it's really quite funny. My Bible has like little like tags at the front of every story, and this one says, Jesus walking on the water. And I'm like, that is not the name of this story. It's Peter walking on water. Like, Jesus, yeah, like, you walk on water, man. Like, that's what you do. You rose from the grave. Like, that is like the 15th most interesting thing you've done in the Gospels is walk on water, right? Like, we believe you do amazing things. What's interesting about this story is that Peter got out of the boat and he walked on water, right? That is something that is far-fetched and hard to imagine, something that is really quite amazing. And so for Peter, as he's in this boat, he's like, Jesus, if it's really you, like, command me to come out. There's a trust in that. He steps out of the boat in trust. But then there's something really important that has to follow that secondarily, which is action. Like, there has to be action that follows that trust. And for generosity, when we think about it, like, it doesn't just require trust that things aren't going to fall apart or that God is going to walk with us or the community has us. But generosity, courageous generosity, requires a level of action. And we see this in the story, right? It says that Peter doesn't just get out of the boat. He does step out of the boat. Jesus says, come. But it says this in the 29th verse, that he began walking on water towards Jesus. Now, we don't know how many steps he took. We don't know if he took 3 or 4, 15. But we do know he closes the gap, and there's action that happens in here. And I think this is like an easy thing to overlook in the stories. When I read the scriptures, and I don't need you to land where I land on this, but like, I don't read them as like 100% literal. Like, not everything that happens has to be exactly what happens. When I read it, I'm like, every word in here does matter to me. And it tells a larger story. And so, like, why would the author, as he's writing this story, tell me that Jesus calls him out of the boat and that Peter takes steps towards Jesus, that he walks on water? Well, he wants us to know that there's some action happening here, right? It wasn't just about the moment of saying, like, Jesus, I trust you enough to get out of the boat, but I trust you enough to walk on this water and believe that I can be here with you to close that gap and to get closer to you. And for Peter, the generosity is like born in trust, but it's really evolved and formed in his action as he walks closer to Jesus and he closes that gap. And I think for many of us, like, that's the place that I think we can get hung up sometimes when I think about generosity of any kind. Like, we want to trust that God is with us. We want to trust that the community has our back. We want to trust that whether it's our time, our talents, or our treasure, that it's going to the right places. Like, the trust can be there, but the action is the part that sometimes hesitates and lags behind as it follows. And for Peter at this moment, he doesn't just trust that he can be out on the water. He walks on that water towards Jesus. He closes the gap. But then the story does have a little bit of a turn. Like, as he walks walks on water, and doesn't say they get to the end and him and Jesus high five and they're like, hey, we did this thing together. They get back in the boat and they go. That's not exactly how it ends. Like, he walks towards him and he begins to sink. And Jesus grabs him and pulls him out. And perhaps one of the more famous lines in the story, if you've not heard any of the story, you maybe have heard this. It's, you of little faith, why did you doubt? As he's pulling him back up. And I was taught, as I read this story early on, that like Jesus was chastising him for losing faith in Jesus. He's like, why didn't you have faith in me, right? Like, you lost faith in me. I'm Jesus. I'm the Son of God. Like, why did you lose faith in me? And like, just logically, as I read this story, I am not convinced that that is what Jesus is saying. Because he doesn't see Jesus sink at all. Jesus is the one still standing on the water, pulling him up from the water. He's the one that was standing out there. They thought he was a ghost. He walked to them. He's done these miraculous things already. He has more to come. I don't think that he lost faith in Jesus. I think he lost faith in his capacity to stand toe-to-toe with Jesus, to close the gap, to do what Jesus did, to walk on water with him. Like, he didn't think his place belonged anymore. He thought he was a fraud. He got imposter syndrome. He started to sink. And what I find really interesting in this is that as he sinks, he's grabbed and he's pulled up out of the water. He's thrown back into the boat. And the end of the story tells us that they don't like workshop what Peter could have done better. And they don't say like, hey, like maybe if you walk with your heels first, you won't sink. They don't do any of that. It says that they worshiped God in that moment. And so when I see this story, like obviously there's failure, but I don't see any judgment in failure. I don't think Peter's saying you lost faith in me, which is the judgment story that we're often told. I think he's like, you lost faith in yourself. I need you to believe in yourself that you can be out here with me. And then they worship God. And when I read this entire story, I don't see anything other than a celebration of the revelation of God's goodness. Like this story continues to reveal God's goodness. And I think when we look at our generosity, when it's stepping out in trust and it's acting in courage, I think that it starts to reveal the goodness of God in different places in our stories. That we see that even in failure, even in success, that as we step out of whatever that boat looks like, as we walk, even if it doesn't feel like we've crushed it, even if we sink, or even if we succeed, that in the act of living in that generosity and that trust and that actions, God's goodness is ultimately revealed to us. And I think that's the challenge for many of us, right? Is to say that it's not about the optics and the metrics of what success looks like, but it's about what does it mean for us to trust and to act and to believe that in success and in failure that the goodness of God is ultimately revealed. And during the course of the series, we've gone back and forth in sharing stories. Like I said, Grammy and Jared, we shared their story a few weeks ago. We shared Rodney's story. Rodney's one of our hospitality volunteers. Many of you have experiences and stories of him creating space for you, helping you feel welcomed in this space. And today we have a story to share of Alex and Anne-Marie White. They're a couple that came to our church back when we were at the brewery. It's been about 2 years since they joined us. And I remember when they came, they would always like sneak in the back, and it was a weird venue setup, like preach kind of in the round, and there was like the outside patio here and the inside brewery inside, and they would always go sit on the stage. And I remember they more like exceptionally faster than anyone I've ever seen. These guys got out of church faster. I mean, they like service would end and they would beeline it to their car. And for weeks I was like, I want to talk to these people. And so one Sunday, like I ended the sermon and I was just like waiting at their car. I was like, hey, I need to talk to you guys. But I invited them to come to, it wasn't quite that stocky and weird, but I invited them to come to check out a small group. And one of the things that they had told me is like, we really like the church, but we just feel like we don't know anyone. We don't feel like we have any community. And I was like, well, hey, maybe you should try checking out this small group. And they got to know people and they got connected. And from that moment, their journey of faith began to kind of be reinvigorated and re-inspired. And they started to explore different ways with their time and their talents and their treasure that they can invest in this community in ways that it could help others find the same sort of meaningful community that they found. And so their story is about their kind of journey from financial generosity as they found this community and what that growth has looked like. And so I'll invite you just to check it out, and we'll come back together in just a second.
My name is Anne-Marie White. This is my husband, Alex, and we found the well on TikTok about 2.5 years ago. And we'd previously broken up with our church before the well, and we're trying to determine our next step in our faith and how we were going to raise our kids. So we attended one service at the brewery and just kept coming back.
So for me, Anne-Marie is one that really mostly inspired me to live more generously because she grew up in a family that was very generous with their time and their money. And even though they didn't have as much, they were still doing that. And so I learned that through her as we've grown in our relationship with not only the church, but in our marriage. We've been taking one more step along the way and just feeling more inspired, seeing those things happen around us in our church and with our friends and our family and anyone that we're being generous with.
It was a slow thing for us to start. Like, I can remember when we were first married and, our incomes were much lower and stuff, so we didn't have a lot of excess income to consider giving. Giving $50 a month was like a huge deal for us. And that was total, not to a church, that was total that we had in our budget that we felt comfortable with donating.
It was a series of conversations. It's not just you don't flip the switch, you slowly talk about it more. So for me, it was learning about and talking about taking one step at a time for, I think even at our previous church too, we learned a little bit about that first step in giving, then take the next step. But it's also, I think, mirrors our conversations and our learnings for how to handle finances in our family. It kind of like that with church as well. It's like, where do we feel comfortable with? Are we on the same page and we just took one step at a time towards where we are today?
We do that because we want to see the church succeed, and we want to see things offered to our children and others in the church.
But we know that we're investing in something that we're a part of. We feel like it does go somewhere, and so we're more inclined to go the next step even, or whether it's Giving Tuesday around Thanksgiving, or if it's somebody in need, or if it's a specific campaign of some sort. Like we're more inclined to give more because we're invested, and we can see the kind of the ripple effects of those donations, even if we don't know exactly how much of an impact that's making.
And I think it's also like, if you make the decision, especially with generosity, doesn't mean you have to do it every week. It doesn't mean you have to do it every month. Try it for a couple weeks, try it for a couple months, and see how it makes you feel, how it affects your finances. Reevaluate. For me, it's part of being a Christian, calling myself a Christian, and helping others along the way. It's all about showing who Jesus is by our actions, without having to shout it from the rooftops.
For me, I think I'm very left-brain, practical-minded. So I think of, how does a church exist? How does it have a facility? How does it provide services without, financial generosity? Money doesn't grow on trees, and so the church can't exist and do the things that we want it to do and be for us and for our friends and for people that we don't even know that may join the church at some later point, if people aren't able to give. So for me, it's just sort of like a survival mentality. This has to happen. If then, that's how I think about it, really. From a different angle than Anne Marie. But still, in the end, it's still the same result. But we think about it differently, but still have the same end goal in mind.
So their story, a few things really stood out to me that I find to be quite interesting. First being, I loved how Anne Marie said, like, it's not an everyday thing, like it's a challenge. And I go back to the story of Peter. Jesus wasn't like, all right, let's get back out on the water and let's try this again. You're taking 10 steps this time. And they do it a week later, and now it's 15. Like, that wasn't how they went about it, but there was this challenge in the moments that arose. And I think that's, for many of us, what you might think is this isn't like this push ourselves to the breaking point, and this isn't a push ourselves to be so generous for the sake of something else. It's to challenge ourselves to say that generosity is a part of our discipleship journey, and that as we push ourselves in the moments that present themselves, God has an opportunity to move in that. And I loved what Alex had to say as well, because when we think about generosity, sometimes we can think about it in terms of, like, I really want to be generous to youth in need, or to the well, or to my school, or whatever. And we think about it as it impacts us, right? Like, this is, how will this impact me or my kid's school or my church, if you think about it here at the well? And what I loved is Alex shifted it from thinking about himself to thinking about those, as he said, that aren't here yet. My friends that aren't here yet, the people that aren't here yet. And even them, that's why I brought up them coming to the church and checking it out. Like, there was a time before they ever came to the well, and someone created space for them out of their generosity of their time, their talents, and their treasure to help them feel welcomed and feel accepted and feel loved. And we have that same opportunity to do that for other people as well. And I think the challenge is to say that when we think about what it means to create a radically inclusive and loving community, that trickles down to every way we engage in our actions, of our generosity, of our time, and our talents, and our treasure. And I go back to Peter's story, which is really interesting, right? Peter sinks, he falls, right, through the water. He gets called Satan by Jesus one time, which, like, I would say is probably not something you want to put on your, like, bucket list of things you want Jesus to call you. He denies Jesus 3 times in his greatest time of need, right? But this same dude is the guy that is preaching in Acts chapter 2 to 3,000 people that have come to know Jesus. And I have to imagine, as he's standing there, he's looking out at the crowd, he's like, how did I get here? Like, how am I the person that was able to do this? Like, I have more failures than I have successes. I have more areas I got it wrong than I got it right. But it's kind of this faithful stepping out of the boat, whatever that looks like. And I imagine and suspect he had to do the same thing as he's getting up to preach in front of these people, that there are people that know him as Peter the failure, Peter the denier, Peter the guy that didn't walk on water. But now there's a group of people that know him as the guy that's sharing a story of hope and good news and transformation for other people as he stepped out of whatever that other new boat was for him. And then we fast forward to like Acts chapter 10, when he's fighting with Paul about who should be included. They're like, should Gentiles be included, or is it just for Jews? And Peter's kind of on the wrong side of this, but him and Paul go back and forth, and his mind is changed. He says, you know what, maybe the gospel is so inclusive, it is so radical, it is so grace-filled that it's not just for the people I think it's for, but it's for everyone. Like he steps out of the boat of his own comfort, of who he thinks should be included and involved, and he says that everyone should be included and involved. And my challenge and my hope for us is to really ponder, like, what are the boats of the safety, the thing that we're in that feel really comfortable, really known, really safe, and challenge ourselves to ask ourselves, like, what would it look like to step out and trust? What would it look like to walk forward in action? What would it look like to believe that those trusting actions actually have the ability to shape the world around us? And believe that I think our generosity can spark a butterfly effect. That like our generosity, the way that we live, can spark something bigger than we imagine. And that would be my challenge and my prayer for you. To like ask yourself to entertain believing that is true. That like your actions and your moments and your beliefs and the way that you give of yourself and whatever that looks like can actually have a lasting and profound impact. That isn't just a drop in the bucket, but it is something that could change the landscape around us. So with that in mind, would you join me in a word of prayer? God, I do thank you that you're a God of goodness. You're a God of generosity. You're a God of transformation. You're a God of those who fail more times than they get it right and never take our seats away for that failure. But you give us unlimited chances to continue walking forward in trust and action with you. And so, God, I ask that you would teach us as much in our successes as you would in our failures, as much in the action as you do in anything else. Help us grow in the knowledge of your goodness and the implications of that goodness in our life and in the lives of others. Pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.